let's take a little closer look at activating units and how it's done. Now, basically, one thing to keep in mind is there is this idea of combat groups. And what this is it's basically 6 or less sections of troops, whether they're tanks or infantry or jeeps or whatever. The max is 6 of these sections that can be in a combat group. Now, it's pretty much based on a platoon-sized organization. They can be combined arms. You could have tanks activating with infantry at once, or all infantry, or it could be just a single section, like a single squad of infantry if you want. That's what defines a command group. Now, if one of those sections is not a platoon commander base, which this is right here in this case, the maximum is 5 sections that you can include in the combat group. It's something to keep in mind. Now, there is a special rule for human waves that allow it to be quite large, these sections, and that's usually associated with the Russians who are able to do that. But normally it's maxed, it's 6 or 5 if there's no platoon section, command section in the combat group. So let's look at an example. Now, in this case, what I want to do during the turn is I want to activate this LNG squad, this infantry squad, this jeep, and this tank section as well. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 sections that I can include in this combat group. Now, unfortunately, there's no platoon commander involved here, because he's not one of the sections involved here. So what that means is I have to pick one of these sections to be a kind of a temporary command section. It's called a lead section in the rules. It's okay to do that, so you don't always need to have a platoon section, command section, in the activation. Some armies require it for certain functions in the game, so it's kind of important for that. But normally you don't really need it. Now, in this case, I would just pick one of these sections to be the lead command section. It's a temporary thing. And for instance, I could choose the jeep. Now, what you do next is once you've decided where your command section is, everybody within 4 inches, in this case, can be activated or included in the combat group. And in this case, the distance is 4 inches. And the reason for that is because it's a combined arms combat group. There's infantry and there is an AFV, the Sherman tank. And the maximum distance is 4. If these were all tanks, it would be much greater. If they were tanks that had radios, it would be 12 inches. If they were radioless AFVs, it would be 6 inches. So that kind of thing. But with infantry, guns, and combined arms combat groups, it's maxed at 4. So let's just double check our range here to the jeep. And yeah, 4 inches. And these, of course, are in command range. So this is a legal combat group that I can activate together with one die roll. Now, the next thing you want to look at is this combat group within HQ contact distance? Now, normally that's 8 inches away from your company HQ. Now, we have a company HQ located up here. You can see him hunkering down in the building. Now, if he's 8 inches or less away from the command section of this group, that's the one you measure to, they are an HQ contact. And if I look at it, yeah, it's just about 7 inches. So this combat group can activate without any further requirements because it's in HQ contact. Now, let's say for the sake of example, this HQ, this company HQ, is way back here. Now, he's obviously further than 8 inches from the command section here of this group. In that situation, this group is considered out of HQ contact. They're not in contact with the company headquarters, too far away. And when this happens, in order to activate this combat group, you're required to pay 1 impetus to do so. So this is going to cost an impetus point for me to attempt to activate them. And I might fail the roll and waste an impetus point just trying to activate them. But that's not the case in this situation. That's basically how that works. Second thing to keep in mind here is if you roll your activation, normally it's a 7+. It's across the board, you need a 7+ to activate any group. If you roll a 5 or a 6, it's called a hesitant result. In other words, they might still activate. It's still possible, and it's called a hesitant result. And what you do when you get that result is you are allowed to add impetus points to the die roll to make it a 7, and therefore activate the group. If you roll less than 5 or 6, if you roll a 4, it's called a command confusion, and you definitely don't activate the unit. There's no time to do it. They don't do it. But otherwise, you can add impetus points to make it a 7, and that's with a hesitant result. So it's basically 1 or 2 points of impetus that you're going to add. Now, that's important because not all armies are capable of doing that. For instance, let's look at the Americans. This is a scenario in 1944. Now, the Americans during this period, they can add impetus points to get that activation score to 7 only if they have a platoon commander or a company HQ that is activating with this group. And in this example, that's not the case. This is just a recon jeep. It's not a platoon HQ, and it's certainly not the company HQ, which is way over here. These guys are activating without a platoon commander, in other words. So the only other way I could add impetus to a failed roll for these guys is if the company HQ himself was within contact with this group, which we measured 8 inches away from the jeep. It is. So for Americans during this period, they can, in this situation, add impetus to get a good result. And again, if he was not within 8 inches, I would be required to activate I'd have to spend an impetus point to even attempt to activate. We covered that. But also, if I fail the roll on a 5 or 6, I can't, in this case, use impetus to activate them, to add to my score to make 7, in other words. I couldn't do it in this case. If this was a platoon commander instead, I could add impetus. Even if the company commander was way back here and not in contact with them, I could still add impetus. That's unique to the Americans of this period. They're quite versatile on this level. Another example would be Germans of the same time period, 1944. Their situation, they can always add impetus with a failed roll of a 5 or a 6, regardless if this was a platoon commander or not. They always have that option. They're very versatile tactically on the field. Of course, to activate, they would still have to pay the extra point of impetus if their headquarters, their company HQ, wasn't within distance of their lead section. So that's the basics of activation. There's a little bit more to it, and you get involved with vehicles and some other nationalities, but that's the basics of it.